And as I said, we're assessing the individuals who apply to us. And if we see evidence of someone being really intensely committed to their subject, really wanting to study it to a high level, in a really focused way, and if they impress us across the various indicators already mentioned, they're receiving an offer.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would they not receive an offer? I mean, how weird would it be for us to say this person is totally impressive in every respect, but unfortunately they went to that school, so we're not making them an offer? I mean, that would be unjustifiable.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We don't have a new guest today, we've got Marcus back.
We've got an old guest. So I'm Marcus Tomlin. I'm the Director of Admissions here at Trinity Hall, and I haven't done one of these for a while, so I'll probably be rusty, but that's okay.
Nice. We've got a nice, easy, straightforward topic to go through today.
A non-controversial, non-contentious topic. Yeah, good.
But no, we have a really interesting topic we're going to go through today. We're going to be talking about school type and talking about state schools and independent schools in the UK, and applications from these schools, and how the university views applications from these schools, because I guess there's a lot of talk around this topic, not normally from the university. So that's what we're here to talk about today, to kind of, I think, especially iron out a lot of myths around this topic, and we want to kind of like try to clear those myths, I guess. So firstly, Marcus, without beating around the bush, does University of Cambridge or Trinity Hall have a preference over applications that are from state schools or independent schools?
The short answer is no.
Yeah.
We're looking for applicants who have really good academic ability and potential, and who we think will really cope well with our courses. And the students who possess those qualities can come from a wide range of different educational backgrounds, and our processes are set up hopefully in such a way that we can identify those qualities, whatever the background someone applies to us from.
Nice. And just for anyone who's listening and are unsure what we mean by definite, like when we say independent schools and state schools, can you explain to us, or might know independent schools as private schools, can you explain what those two terms mean? Yeah.
So there is quite a lot of terminology around all of this. So these days, there's a little cluster of terms that are often used in kind of the same way. So private schools, and some of them are slightly confusingly sometimes called public schools. Yep. They're what are often classified as independent schools, and basically what that means is that the students who attend those schools have to pay fees in order to attend them, or usually their parents pay fees for their children to attend them. And then there's a cluster of terms for schools. State school would be one of the most commonly used terms. But the other term that's used quite a lot, and it's probably the term I'll use during this podcast because it's the one that's used most widely these days, is maintained school or maintained sector school. And they're basically schools that are funded by the state. And so usually the students who attend those schools don't have to pay fees in order to attend them. And I think, one of the reasons why, you said quite correctly that, a conversation around these sorts of issues isn't something that this university or many universities really sort of, I guess, initiates too often. It's simply because these two basic categories, independent and maintained, disguise so many differences. The use of these two terms at quite a high level makes it seem as if there's a lot of sort of uniformity across independent schools, a lot of uniformity across maintained schools, when actually the truth is quite the opposite. So there are many different independent schools. Some of them are extremely well off financially. Some of them are not particularly well off financially. Some of them regularly send students to leading universities. Some quite rarely send students to leading universities. And you get the same sort of diversity in the maintained sector as well. So there, as we'll probably talk about later, there are some schools that are maintained sector schools that were maybe founded in the 16th century, are very wealthy, have amazing grounds and facilities, but strictly they're maintained sector schools. And they might have a very strong tradition of sending students to top universities, but again, they're maintained sector. So these two terms, they're kind of useful. They sort of make sense, but I do think it's important to be aware of the sort of complexity that they can sometimes conceal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And I think you explained it really, really clearly there, how to use the umbrella term independent school to generalise lots of very different narratives under one umbrella is a generalisation. And the podcast, it's called, the podcast that we did previously, How We Assess Your Application. That, if anyone who's interested in how we assess applicants individually, and we never generalise an applicant depending on a variety of things, including their school type. You can see in that podcast how admissions tutors like Marcus goes through each application with a lot of attention to detail. And never kind of assuming that all students from a certain group, like a maintained school or independent school, are therefore coming from the same background.
Absolutely. And just to give one example to follow on from that, I mean, it's perfectly possible for a student to attend an independent school, but to have a full means-tested bursary. So what that normally means is it's a student whose academic ability has been noticed at a relatively early stage of their academic career, and maybe the local independent school has given them the opportunity to study at that school for free. So if you like, that's the kind of social mobility thing that's kicked in at an early stage of that person's academic career. So yes, they apply, say, to a university like us or any other university from an independent school. But I think it would be wrong of us not to consider all the circumstances that they've had to contend with, because it's likely that in some cases they've come from really quite significant social and economic disadvantage. So that's why we try as best we can to get a more complete picture, and we don't just say, well, these are all the ones that have applied from independent schools, full stop. These are all the ones that have applied from maintained sector schools, full stop, and then somehow assume that those are identical people in those two groups, because the diversity is phenomenal. Yeah,
exactly. And I think, am I right in thinking that we have data on how the performance of individual schools, and then therefore can compare an applicant's, let's say, their GCSE scores to the average results that a school performs. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is a lot of people would say independent schools are better than maintained schools in terms of performance, but it's not as straightforward as that.
Not at all, and we do have that sort of information available to us when we're making our admissions-related decisions, and we also have information about how many students a particular school sends to Oxbridge, so either Oxford or Cambridge every year. So again, if we see, the school routinely sends, 25, 30 people to either Oxford or Cambridge every year, that's fine, we can see that. Whereas if we see that a school hasn't sent any students to either Oxford or Cambridge for the last 3 years or whatever, we can see that as well. And again, this just helps us make hopefully good decisions in an informed way, factoring in the educational background of the applicants in addition to all sorts of other things that we have to do with their academic ability and potential.
Yeah, exactly. Because I can imagine because there are different degrees of Oxbridge applications, at least from different independent schools, and I can imagine a student going to an independent school where they don't send a lot of applications to Cambridge will feel a sense of injustice if they were to be compared equally to another independent school where they do make a lot of applications.
Exactly. So we have that information so that we avoid us making assumptions that aren't, based in some kind of reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So within the umbrella term maintained schools, could you explain what different types of state schools there are, or maintained schools there are?
Yeah, so it often breaks down into various subtypes. I guess the main ones would be things like comprehensive schools, but we also have things like sixth form colleges are usually classified as maintained sector, and also grammar schools are usually classified as maintained sector as well. So there's different types of schools, might have slightly different sort of characteristics or properties, but broadly speaking, they're all grouped together in this rather crude way, as we were saying earlier, as maintained sector, just because of how the funding works for them.
And just for anyone who who's a bit confused about grammar schools, because I know the history about grammar schools is quite complex. Can you explain a little bit about the history behind grammar schools?
Yeah. So the history is quite a long one. So many grammar schools were established in, say, the 16th century. So they're pretty old establishments. Not in every case, but in a large number of cases. But I think really from a sort of contemporary point of view, it's really in the 1940s. There's this thing called the 1944 Education Act that introduced two main sort of types of school. Were the grammar schools, and those were the schools that students went to if they were considered to have the kind of intellectual ability to be able eventually to apply to university. So that was for the kids who were considered to be like, particularly gifted academically, and they had to take an exam that was usually called the 11 plus to determine whether they should go to the grammar school or not. If they didn't go to the grammar school, then they went to what really became known as a secondary modern school, and that did teach some academic subjects like English and history and things like that, but it also included more sort of vocational things like woodwork or metalwork or home economics, things like that. And so that was the pattern that was in place for quite a few decades. And then in the 60s, there was growing concern about this pattern. It was felt that it reinforced social class divisions in the country. So that's really when there was a movement to try to phase out grammar schools. And that's when comprehensive schools were introduced, where students would be taught together whether they were academically gifted or not. But it was never the case that all the grammar schools were phased out. Some of them continued, and so that's why some of them still exist today. I think you have to check the numbers. I think there's about 160 or so in England, and about 60 or 70 in Northern Ireland as well. So a relatively small number, but they are usually academically selective schools. So again, in that tradition, students normally have to take some sort of exam or some sort of test in order to obtain a place at the school. So it does mean that they very often do produce students who have great ability, but it's a relatively small number of schools that fall into that category.
Nice. And so, because I think not all grammar schools have the word grammar in their school name.
Nope.
So am I right in thinking that a school is a grammar school if they're selective in their admissions process, and a school is a comprehensive school if they're non-selective, but they're both maintained schools?
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. And in terms of applications to, actually before we go on to that, could you also explain what are sixth form colleges in comparison to your comprehensive school and your grammar school?
Yeah, so really, as the name suggests, I mean, a sixth form college is normally where people go just to study, in effect, their A levels, or it can be equivalent to A level, but really just for that sort of short period of time, relatively short period of time, which is why they're sort of often, they're in the maintained sector category, but they're often seen as being a distinct subcategory within that, just because again they have slightly different conventions, slightly different patterns, slightly different traditions, and so it's useful not to just give the impression that they function in exactly the same way as comprehensive schools or grammar schools, because they don't. They're distinctive and often very, very effective at what they do.
Because I guess they're institutions that only have, I'm not sure which key stage it is, but year 12 and year 13, and they don't have a year, imagine it's key stage 4 and key stage 3. They only have key stage 5.
Yep.
So coming back to applications and acceptances to Cambridge from the maintained sector and independent schools, can you explain to us, like, historically how that's been? Has there been much change with regards to acceptances from these two school categories? Yeah,
and I guess we should. I mean, perhaps people know already. We should probably just explain that the three sort of terms we often use when we're looking at these kind of statistics. So there's the number of applications we receive, which obviously is just the number of people who apply to us. There's a number of offers that we make. And then the other number is the number of acceptances. And what that really means is people who successfully met their offer conditions. And so usually the number of acceptances is a subset of the number of offers.
Yep.
And for these two broad categories, independent and maintained, I mean, personally, I think it's most relevant to go back to sort of the 70s and 80s and then think about how it's progressed since then. It's possible to go back even further than that, but so much has changed when you get back 100 years or 150 years that it starts becoming, a little bit superficial. So back in the 70s, the 80s, say this, up to the sort of mid-80s, it was roughly sort of 50-50, 50% independent, 50% maintained in terms of people who were successful in meeting their offer from Cambridge. And so during that period, from the sort of mid-80s on, those ratios have gradually shifted, so that currently it varies a bit from year to year, but it's around sort of 75-ish% from the maintained sector, and about 25-ish%, plus or minus a percentage point or two, from the independent sector. So that's been the most kind of conspicuous development, just using those two categories.
And that's just UK applications.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point, because we talk about independent schools. There are schools that are called independent schools overseas, so in countries other than the UK. But usually when we talk about independent versus maintained, we're just talking about students who were at school in the UK. So again, it's here we're sort of talking about a kind of subset of all the applications that we make, because each year we do make applications to people from overseas, but we're not really talking about them today. We're just talking about the sort of UK based subset of all of those.
Nice. And if anyone was interested in looking at these numbers of applications, offers and acceptances, all of this data, at least from the past decade, is on the University of Cambridge admissions data, and we'll have a link in the caption. This is what I've got here in front of me, in case I need to look at the data. And there's a lot of different categories that they look into, and one of them each year is school type. So you could, if you wanted to look at the data of 2013 to 2023 and really compare the actual numbers and percentages, you can do that.
And I'd really encourage people to do that. I mean, just because we often have people coming to visit us here in the college on open days and things like that, and more often than I might expect, I have it's usually, to be fair, the parent of someone who's thinking of applying, and they come up to me and they say, can I ask a question about admissions? And I say, sure. And they say, why is it that the percentage of students from maintained sector schools who successfully get an offer from Cambridge is still only 50%? And my initial thought is, well, it's so easy, for that person or for anyone else to just check to see whether that's true or not. And I mean, in that case, it's just not true, and that's what I say in the conversation. But in a sense, that's not something I need to be asked, because all of that information is in the public domain. It's just just type in, I don't know, Cambridge University admission statistics, and it will take you to the relevant page that's got all the files for the last 10 years with all the relevant statistics, and people can see the numbers. So there's no secrecy there. We're not hiding anything. It's all in the public domain. It just requires a little bit of tapping on a keyboard to find out the numbers. And I think the reason why people do ask questions like that is, again, it's often the parents of people who applied, because maybe when they were at university, that's what the percentage was. And maybe they just don't know that things have changed in the intervening years, which is fine. That's not really a criticism. I'm just saying it's very easy to get fully up to date on those details before attending an open day or something like that.
Yeah, and I guess it's easy to assume that things haven't changed from a certain place since you've left it.
Yep.
And especially if you haven't engaged with that area since then
That's right.
And
I think that's why this is a topic that we were joking at the start and saying it's contentious and things. I think one of the reasons why it's got that kind of reputation as a topic is because, frankly, everyone has an opinion on it. Like if you've managed to get to the age of 18 and you've never had any connection with any kind of educational system in the UK, you've done. That's impressive, right? You've had to work really hard to avoid that. I mean, you must really be on the kind of fringes of society to have managed to do that. For the, 99.9 recurring % of people, they will have encountered at some point some type of education, even if they're homeschooled. They might be following the national curriculum or something like that. So everyone has an opinion of it because everyone has some experience of it. And that's fine, but as I say, one's own personal experience of education as one ages gets increasingly remote, and that's when it's worth just making sure that those things that annoyed you back in the day, should you still be annoyed about them now, or has it changed a bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very ironic that to prepare for this podcast, we've solely relied and used this data that is in the public domain, this is everything that we're talking about, all the stats. Despite that we might have opinions on the matter, we've made sure that anything that we say is in line with the data, and that data is in the public domain. In other words, if someone was to go through the admissions stats as we have, and look at the numbers and make inferences from the numbers, they would see where what we're saying and where we're coming from, because we're using the same numbers. But it's a good point that there is a myth and assumptions about Cambridge that might not be true to this day. I was wondering, do you have an idea of why? Because I know that I've heard in open days some people describe Cambridge as an elitist institution. Where does that idea come from?
I think it's fair to say it comes from the past, because I think it'd be tricky to argue that Cambridge has never been an elitist institution. I mean, again, I think if you go back into the 1920s, 1910s, I think it was a university, and if you went to certain schools, it was a university that you had relatively easy access to. And so if by elitist we mean something that's there for just a select group of sort of privileged individuals, I think at many points in its history, it has been that kind of place. And if anyone wants to argue against that, they've got to work pretty hard to sort of find evidence that wasn't true back then. I think the question that's most relevant, certainly for potential applicants, is that still the case today? And I mean, my response to that would be no, it isn't. We're a university that actively seeks applications from the widest possible range of applicants. And, as I say, for the reasons we've already mentioned, we try to assess those applications as fairly as possible. We don't have sort of like hidden quotas and things behind the scenes. The things that we say publicly about how the admissions process works are true. That's how we handle admissions. And I think the term elitist, I mean, it's a kind of interesting one because obviously ultimately it comes from the word elite, and yet if we talk about someone as being elite, at what they do, that's normally a compliment. So if we talk about an elite athlete, that means they're like a really, really good athlete. So I think what I'd say is that, the various people who do research at Cambridge and who teach and the students who come here to study, I think I'd be relatively at ease saying they're elite in that they try and do what they do as well as they possibly can. And hopefully in a way that's comparable with how people are doing it at other world-leading universities. But I think there's a difference between being elite and being elitist. Yeah. And I'd say while hopefully the people here are elite at what they do, they're not elitist.
Yeah. And I guess the word elitist is used in reference, I guess the idea beneath that is an assumption that if you have a lot of economic power, if you're very wealthy and you come from a very wealthy background, then the idea that Cambridge is elitist is that Cambridge is almost an inevitable thing in your path, which might have been true hundreds of years ago, but that's not.
It's just not how it works. It's just not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I was in the office during the results day, and that's not. No matter where you've come from, sadly we have to reject students who didn't make their offer, and at not one point is like where students' background ever mentioned. I don't think I've ever asked, but how wealthy are this person's parents? I mean, for a start, we don't have that information. And even if we did, what's that got to do with the academic ability and potential of the person to whom we made the offer? So no, it's just not a consideration. Yeah, it's an entirely academic one's potential to thrive in the course.
And I think you can see that, we've probably mentioned this in previous podcasts, can't remember, but I think you can see that in the dropout rate. So the dropout rate at Cambridge, by that I mean the students who fail to finish their course once they've started it. I mean, just year in, year out, it's below 1%. It's normally sort of 0.6, 0.7. Whereas for some other universities, it's much higher than that. So we take that as a sign that as a result of our admissions processes, we end up admitting students who can cope with our courses. Because I think if we sort of, I don't know, strategically or maybe cynically offered places to students from particular groups, even if we weren't convinced that they had the academic ability and potential, presumably some of them just, a larger number than we have at present just wouldn't be able to complete their course. So it would probably be around sort of 15%, didn't finish their course. So the fact that it's so low, and the ones who don't finish their course, it's normally because of some pretty awful personal circumstances. It's often health related or something like that. It's rarely, very, very rarely that they just can't cope academically. So I always think that's an important number to look at alongside all the stuff about, applications and offers and acceptances, because it suggests that most of the time we're making pretty good decisions based on the academic information that we have.
Because the courses are challenging, and if you weren't chosen for your academic potential, then there would be a higher dropout rate.
You'd struggle.
Yeah.
You'd struggle.
But from the data, everyone can see that there has been an increase of acceptances from maintained schools since the 80s. From the data, you can see that at least since the 2010s. And I was wondering, why has that been the case?
Yeah, I mean, it's really because we now receive more applications from students who are at maintained sector schools. I mean, just over the last kind of 10-year period, I think about 10 years ago, it was around sort of 6,000 people applied from the maintained sector, whereas for the last few years it's been closer to 9,000, just over 9,000. So just in that 10-year period, it's an increase of about 3,000. And if you compare it back to what's going on in the 80s, it's increased even more since then. And then you might say, well, okay, why has that happened? Well, again, I think various reasons. It's much easier to get information about the Cambridge application process now than it was even 20, 25 years ago. That's to do with online resources and all the information that's available. That's improved dramatically, even in my lifetime. And also, it's to do with universities like this, but also many other universities actively developing initiatives around widening participation and outreach, because 20, 25 years ago, we knew that there were many maintained sector schools who just weren't engaging with us, just weren't even thinking about encouraging their students to apply to a university like Cambridge. And so we've spent a lot of time liaising with those sorts of schools, helping them to understand our processes more deeply. And in many cases over the years, that's resulted in an increase in applications from those sectors, from those areas. So I think that's what lies behind those statistics. And again, I often think a useful way of looking at the admissions data is to look at the percentages from the applications to the offers to the acceptances and see how much they move. So, for instance, as a college, just to talk about it from a college level here at Trinity Hall, when we look at the maintained sector percentage, it tends to be relatively constant from applications to offers to acceptances. So for us at the moment, it's around sort of 72, 73% maintained sector, and that stays relatively constant across those three stages. Which I think indicates that, it's a recruitment issue in a sense. So in other words, if in a given year, 90% of all the people who apply to us came from the maintained sector, it's highly likely that 90% of our offers would go to people from those sorts of schools, and then about 90% would be successful. So that's, I think, what causes the shift. It's the change in the application patterns that cause the shift in the percentages for the other stages.
I think it's a really good point, and you can also see that in the data, which is in the caption below. There's the application rates and the offers rate and the acceptances, and you can see how much the numbers change. And when you see that the percentages don't change that much from applications, offers to acceptances, that does lead one to assume that then it's what the percentage, what the application number is, will then have a huge part to play in how the rest of the what percentage the acceptances will be. So just to clarify, just so I'm on the right page, because in the 2000s, it was. In terms of maintained school to independent school proportions, in Cambridge, it was roughly 50%, 50%. and now it's roughly 75% maintained school and 25% independent, give or take a few percentages. I know that some people will look at that data and will say, well, that clearly shows a bias towards state school since the 2000s. What are the way, how does an increase of applications increase the stat of changes this? How does an increase of applications explain the data? If you see what I mean.
I think it just means that we're getting a large number of applications from the maintained sector.
Yeah.
We're getting a large number of applications that are really competitive from the maintained sector. And I think when we're placed in that situation, it's just inevitable that more of the offers will go to those applicants.
So am I right in thinking? So something say 30 or 40 years ago, there wasn't podcasts like this, as many online resources, just not the information. Get as much information. Maintained schools didn't have as much information about even how to do a Cambridge application, let alone how to do a good application, and that there were a lot of students who had the potential but just didn't have the information on, and didn't end up.
That's right. The information was communicated through sort of hard copy printed prospectuses, and all the forms that had to be filled in, or obviously all hard copy forms that had to be filled in by hand. And if your school just didn't have those, you might not even know it was an option. I mean, again, depending upon your background, you might not have known anyone who's ever been to Oxford or Cambridge. And so, sure, if you've got an older brother who's been, then your older brother, well, I did this and that, so it helps. But if you're sort of first generation going to university, and if your school doesn't say, oh, have a look at this hard copy prospectus, you might find it interesting, you just wouldn't think to do it. Whereas now, people can find their own way to that information. You don't need your school to say, oh, look at these websites. You might think, oh, I'm interested in applying to Cambridge. You can go to all the relevant web pages. You can get pretty much all the information you need. If your school is able to help and support you, great. But even if your school isn't able to do that, you can still prepare a really competitive application completely independently. And that's the thing that's changed beyond recognition since say the mid-80s to the present, and particularly in the last 20 to 25 years.
So with the growth of in the internet and social media, it makes sense that there's also growth of applications from everywhere.
Right. Which is also why we've seen a significant increase in overseas applications, which again we're not primarily talking about today, but that's another factor. So the whole sort of situation is more competitive than it was, certainly 25, 30, 40 years ago. There are more people applying from the maintained sector. There are more people applying from overseas. So again, it's kind of inevitable that more of our offers will go to the groups that are sending us really competitive applications.
So the next thing I've got here is that a lot of people note that I think he used to be 93%, but I think very recently it's become 94%. 94% of students in the UK go to maintained schools, and I think assume the remaining 6% roughly go to independent schools, and a lot of people would say, well, that if 94% of the students in the UK go to maintained schools, why is it not the case that 94% of the Cambridge undergrads come from maintained schools? Because the number at the moment is around 70 to 75%. I think it's 73% as of 2023. And I was wondering if you had is there an explanation behind that?
Yeah, it's something that we're sometimes asked about, and I think the sort of explanation, as it were, is simply that while it's the case that about 94% of students attend maintained sector schools, they don't all take 3 A-levels or equivalent, and they're not all predicted to get something close to our standard conditional offers. So, A star, AA on the arts and humanities side, and 2 A stars and an A on the science side. And when you look at the percentage of students who attend maintained sector schools who fall into that subgroup, it's a lot closer to the sorts of percentages that you see when you look at the patterns we were talking about earlier, particularly the percentages of acceptances that go to applicants from the maintained sector.
Yeah, I think is there a case to be made that there are some schools in the maintained sector that aren't that for and where it's not the students' fault at all, aren't performing as well as the rest of like other maintained schools and independent schools.
Yeah, I mean that certainly does seem to be the case when you look at the various pieces of information, the data that's available, and I guess it's one of those situations where the universities are sort of the recipients of those imbalances, I suppose, if you want to think of it as being an imbalance, a sort of disparity of provision. It's not something that as universities we have any sort of direct control or influence over, really. Yeah, so. As I say, what we do have control and influence over are the widening participation initiatives and the outreach initiatives that we're responsible for. We can go into schools and talk to people about our processes and things like that. But we can't really directly alter the sort of patterns of exam results that students in certain schools obtain. So, as I say, we're the kind of recipients of those rather than the instigators of those.
Yeah, I guess. Exactly. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that if there are some schools where they produce, the data shows that there aren't many students who or that they're below average in how many students get grades that are meeting the entry requirements, that shows that is specific to that school and not specific to those students, which I guess leads on to quite nicely how we contextualise offers. And I was wondering if you could explain, I know you have in other podcasts like our Assessing Application podcast, but if you could explain again what do we mean by when we contextualize, like by contextualization, and when we contextualize applications?
Yeah, well, we have various pieces of information about the schools that the applicants attend, so we can try and get a pretty good sense as to whether the academic performance that student has achieved to date and the predicted grades are sort of typical for that school, or atypically high for that school, or atypically low for that school. In addition, we have information about the sort of socioeconomic circumstances in which the student has been living and studying. And these are the sorts of things that we sort of we look at. So, I mean, to give a sort of slightly sort of crude, I guess, sort of almost stereotypical example, I mean, if someone applies to us from a particular school and they're predicted to get, I don't know, 2 A stars and an A at A level, let's say for an arts and humanities subject, that might be absolutely normal for that school. That might be what they just standardly produce, and actually it's the students who get 3 A stars that are the really, really strong ones for that school. But then if someone applied to us with exactly the same predicted grades or achieved grades, if they're applying post-qualification, and if they came from a school where the standard A-level results, that people normally get might be just, I don't know, an A and 2 Bs, then it seems as if in relation to that educational context, the student who's accurately being predicted, let's say 2 A stars and an A, is really exceptional. And they've maybe got some ability, or they've really worked incredibly hard to be in a position where they might achieve those grades. So exactly the same A-level predictions, and the same is true for IB and Scottish Highs and all the other things. although they're the same in terms of the details of the predictions, we might contextualize it slightly differently given the information that we have about the school and about the socioeconomic circumstances. And, I think that's a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah,
we're trying to get a sort of complete picture, or as complete a picture as possible, of the circumstances in which that student has been living and studying. And we don't just look at the grades kind of in the abstract, because it's always tempting to do things in a kind of abstract way, but you miss a lot of the important details if you do that.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to, am I right in thinking that, or I just wanted to make it clear that we contextualise, and that contextualisation is in order to get a full picture of each individual student and applicant, and to see how much potential they have and how would they cope with the course. And that contextualisation isn't a bias towards against any schools.
No. I mean, if someone applies and if their school exam record to date is relatively weak, and if they underperform compared to most applicants in, say, any admissions assessments we ask them to take, and if they come for interviews and if they underperform in relation to most applicants, when it comes to the interviews. So in other words, if they sort of underperform across all the things we're looking at, I can't really imagine a possible scenario where I'd say, well, despite all of that, because they're from a maintained sector school or whatever, we'll make them an offer anyway. It goes back to what I was saying about the kind of dropout rate. If we did that systematically, the dropout rate would be way higher than 1%, right?
Yeah.
Because at making an offer to someone who really sort of underperformed across all of those academic indicators, even when we contextualized it, it's just going to struggle with the courses that we offer here. And so, as I say, sometimes in the sort of public-facing web pages and things, that the university produces, it says, we make our offers regardless of school type. And I know what they mean by that. What they mean is, without any bias, if you like, around school type. The reason I don't quite like the word regardless is it kind of implies that we don't look at that. We do look at it. We are aware of it. We contextualize the application in relation to it, but hopefully in a way that's just fair and in a way that can be justified. So, it's not, when people say regardless, it doesn't mean that we just throw away that information. Hopefully it just means that we handle it in a really sensible and reasonable manner.
So like we use the information that we have on the school to understand the applicant more, rather than judge the applicant depending on the kind of school they go to. Absolutely.
I mean, when people apply to us, we're assessing the applicants.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not assessing their schools. And yes, the applicant has come through the school, but personally, I really strongly reject this idea that schools are like production line sort of conveyor belt things, and if someone goes to a school, it means they're likely to be a certain type of person. The evidence that I've experienced over the years, teaching at a university like this, just doesn't indicate to me that's true.
I think, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I have a lot of sympathy for students who, let's say, they go to like a very strong independent school that's known for producing certain types of academics, and by complete just by complete luck or randomness, they also have they have a genuine passion for their subject, a passion that they truly believe would have existed whichever background they'd come from, and it's heartbreaking to imagine that someone will hear an independent school name and then just kind of write them off as they're only making this application because of their background, and they wouldn't be really interested to study come to Cambridge if they'd been elsewhere, and that's just kind of ignoring their whole history.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, we're assessing the individuals
Yeah.
who apply to us. And if we see evidence of someone being really intensely committed to their subject, really wanting to study it to a high level, in a really focused way, and if they impress us across the various indicators already mentioned, they're receiving an offer.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would they not receive an offer? I mean, how weird would it be for us to say this person is totally impressive in every respect, but unfortunately they went to that school, so we're not making them an offer? I mean, that would be unjustifiable.
Yeah, exactly, and unfair. Because I know, Marcus, that you also teach for certain subjects and several subjects, and so you've had a lot of engagement with undergraduate students, not just students who are applying to Cambridge, but also the students who are studying here. I just want to ask you this question for anyone who's watching this and would be are quite curious about applying to Cambridge, can see themselves enjoying Cambridge, but go to a school that's, whether it's not performing so well or just doesn't have any, never has any Cambridge applicants. Have you ever taught students who have come from schools where they have very few Cambridge applications, but have you seen students come from those backgrounds and thrive at Cambridge?
Absolutely. I mean, I think pretty much every year, I end up teaching someone who comes from precisely that kind of background, and again, it's why I'm sort of, I guess, more interested in them as individuals and their motivation and their academic interests than I am in almost sort of where they've come from.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name names, that wouldn't be fair, but I can think of specific examples of students who have come from schools where, with the best intentions, the school hasn't been able to be particularly supportive of the applicant, but for the reasons we mentioned earlier, because of the availability of information, they've sort of found their way to Cambridge being a possibility for them and have put together an application. And in order to do that, those applicants have already developed some of the qualities we're looking for. We're looking for people who have kind of independence of mind, who take the initiative, who don't wait until they're given something. If they want something, they sort of find a way of acquiring it. And so often, when those students end up applying to Cambridge, that gives a strong indication of their seriousness of purpose. Yeah. And then if they impress us academically in the interviews and the admissions assessments, whatever else, again, we're certainly going to offer to them. And then, as you say, when they arrive, 9 times out of 10, they absolutely thrive and flourish here because they've done their research, they know what they've applied for, they want to come, and they see it really as being given, an opportunity to develop further, which again is what we're looking for. We don't want to make offers to people who see getting to Cambridge as being, mission accomplished. We want to make offers to people who see, starting as a student at Cambridge as the beginning of some kind of mission or some sort of adventure, right? It's the beginning of something. It's not the culmination, really, of anything. It's not only the culmination of something. It's the beginning. And those students often have that to a particularly heightened extent, I would say. And
the courses are so challenging that it would be a shame for someone to realise that that the university, the undergraduate experience is not the end, but the beginning as they've started. You don't want to realise that you've chosen the wrong course, the wrong university, whilst you're in the middle of it.
Exactly.
You would want to make more informed choices beforehand, and I think it's Cambridge has that the prestige and the name of the fame of the institution, and I think students can want to would apply for the university for that, but that's not necessarily the best reasons
Absolutely.
do so.
It comes down to the courses and what you're going to be studying, and if the courses that we offer are the right one for a particular applicant, that's the reason to apply. Really, that's the primary reason to apply.
So we've been talking about how recently with like the internet, social media, applicants and students have been able to quite independently make very good applications, and that has kind of explains, like, that's kind of why we made this podcast, in trying to create a lot of resources for applicants who, for whatever reason, just don't know much about Cambridge or don't know much about the admissions process. And now that we've created a lot of content, from the content that we've already made, do you think like an applicant solely from the podcast would have enough information to make a good application?
I think they'd have a huge amount of information, some of which is information that's available on web pages and other sources. But I think in addition to that, they'd have the sort of personal perspectives from the people who live and work and study here. And that's something that it's not usually so easy to get from the web pages. The web page is very good at giving sort of factual information about how to apply and the deadlines and all of that, and that's important. But, listening to one of the podcasts with one of the current undergraduates talking about their course, explaining how it works, explaining how you get a sort of work-life balance and all of that sort of stuff, I think that's every bit as important. I think that's invaluable, and that's what things like this podcast series provide, that it can be tricky to get via other routes.
Because alongside those podcasts on the specific courses, before that we've also done podcasts on admission, interviews, advice, supercritical activities for your personal statement. And we've had podcasts talking about how we assess applications using all of the pieces of data holistically. The podcast obviously can never be a substitute for one's grades, and you would need those grades and to do well in each of these parts of the admissions process, whether it's written work, which we've also talked about in depth, interviews, personal statement, etc. But I think the podcast makes the application a lot easier because we explain all of these steps in so much detail, which things like this podcast and other resources online has the data shows that this has had an increase of applications to Cambridge and will continue increasing applications to Cambridge. So the next thing that we have, so also from the admissions data, you can see that, because for anyone who doesn't know, University of Cambridge is made up of 29 undergraduate colleges for the undergraduate student body. And some people, when they look at the data, will want to know why the ratio of maintained school students and students who've come from maintained backgrounds from the maintained sector and students who've come from independent schools, why the ratios differ from college to college. And I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, I think for reasons that it's sometimes hard for us to sort of figure out, and it's fair, I think, to say that those ratios can shift quite a lot from year to year. So in a given year, a particular college might have a higher percentage from the maintained sector, and then the following year it might be a lower percentage from the maintained sector. I think sometimes it reflects the sort of things we've mentioned, so that the particular kinds of widening participation and outreach activities that a particular college has initiated and been involved with. So I think that there are a range of factors as to why those percentages can differ and can vary. And I think, again, something that we've discussed on previous podcasts is this important part of the admissions process called the winter pool. And as we've said, that's our sort of redistribution mechanism. And so, if someone applies to a particular college in a given year and they get kind of just edged out of receiving an offer at that stage, there's another opportunity for them to receive an offer subsequently from another college. And so that's what I'm really saying there, is that, someone might look at, say, the most recent statistics and think, oh, because I'm at this kind of school, I wouldn't apply to that particular college because of their ratios, like the year before. But you may end up receiving an offer from that college anyway, even if you apply to a different one, because of the way the redistribution mechanism works. So as ever, my sort of general advice about choosing colleges is that it's just far less important than choosing the right course. And that's maybe something else we can discuss a little bit today, because those ratios sometimes differ a bit from courses, not just colleges. But I wouldn't be sort of encouraged or discouraged about applying to a particular college based on the ratios in terms of school type that you see from the previous year, just because it can vary so much. And just to tie it back to something that we discussed a bit earlier, I remember a couple of years ago now, I won't say which subject it is, but for one of the subjects here at Trinity Hall, we ended up making 8 offers for that subject. 5 of them went to people who were at independent schools, but all of them were on full means tested bursaries. That's just the way it played out. That wasn't any social engineering. That was just how it played out. They were just the ones that impressed us most. And so, for that subject that year, it meant that that the percentage from the independent sector was higher than you might expect.
Oh, I see, yeah.
But it wasn't a problem. Because when you go beneath that rather superficial higher level and look in more detail at what's going on, it seemed to me entirely appropriate that those offers should go to those people, because they were the ones who impressed us most academically, and they came from really quite complex and interesting backgrounds. So again, these higher level numbers disguise all sorts of more interesting details. So don't place too much weight on them, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's I think it's that real example kind of really it makes it a lot easier to see how you can make assumptions from the school type and the numbers without realizing the specific narratives underneath them for each applicant. Because I guess that also you could see you could also say the same for maintained schools. It doesn't necessarily, you don't know whether like someone who's gone to a maintained school would what kind of class background they came from, whether they're from a very wealthy background or not as a wealthy background, and you can't tell that from school type.
No, it's a very crude indicator, really, for the reasons we've discussed earlier.
And also from the data, there's a list of all the subjects that Cambridge offers, and there's from subject to subject. There are differences in the ratio of how many maintained school students there are to independent schools. That the ratio can change from subject to subject. So I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's probably worth looking at a couple of examples there. Yeah. So sometimes the sort of ratios are as they are because of the sorts of subjects that are taught at A-level or IB or equivalent at particular types of schools. So perhaps the most obvious example to consider is, say, classics. So actually at Cambridge, we have sort of 2 classics courses. There's a course that lasts for 3 years and there's a course that lasts for 4 years. In order to apply for the 3-year course, you normally need to have really good A-level or equivalent Latin, right? And that just tends to be a subject that's taught more extensively in independent schools. It is taught in some maintained sector schools, but more extensively, I would say, in independent schools. So when you look at the statistics for the Classics 3-year course recently, it's around sort of 30% maintained sector people who apply, people who receive offers, and then acceptances. So the people who meet their offer conditions. So it's about 30%, and it doesn't really fluctuate that much. For the 4-year classics course, which is a course where you don't need to have studied Latin at school. You can start to study Latin as a language while you're here as a student. That's in recent years around sort of 80% maintained sector, and again that remains relatively constant from applications to offers to acceptances. So I think that those two different varieties of classics kind of capture in miniature the sort of difference. And in that case, as I say, it has to do with which sorts of A-levels it's easier to study because there's more opportunity to study them in particular schools. The other sorts of subjects where you sometimes see a bit of a skewing, although less so than was the case maybe sort of 10 or 20 years ago, are subjects like history of art. And also to some extent music, although music is fairly close to sort of 50-50 split. And again, it has to do with music being available as an A-level or equivalent subject at certain schools. And it's one of those subjects that's a little bit more expensive to teach because you don't just need some books, you often need some quite specific equipment, instruments or whatever.
Music lessons are expensive,
right? And so it's a subject that not all maintained sector schools are able to offer. And again, it's where the universities are the sort of recipients of patterns that are established at earlier stages in the kind of education system. I mean, should music be taught more extensively across every single school type in the UK? Plenty of musicians who would say yes. And if you think about the sort of analytical skills students learn studying, say, harmony and counterpoint, the sort of rules of composition and how to apply those, it's every bit as analytical and as intellectually demanding as studying maths. And then in addition to that, you have to understand all the social and cultural elements of music and how it works, which is something you don't have to learn when you study maths, because maths isn't usually taught in that way at school. So there may well be very strong reasons why music should be taught uniformly in all schools. The reality is that's just not possible, and it often comes down to funding and schools having to make what are often extremely difficult decisions about which subjects are going to offer and not offer to their students. But these are patterns that the universities kind of receive rather than create. And the reason we introduced the 4-year classics course was because we recognized that students were being disadvantaged. They weren't able to study classics at university because they hadn't been able to study Latin or Greek. So we designed a course so that wouldn't be a barrier, and the statistics indicate that it served that purpose quite effectively.
The 4-year classics course is a great course because there be people who really find classics fascinating, didn't happen to have the opportunity to study Latin beforehand, but because of that course they are still able to do the degree and learn Latin whilst they're here.
Which is a really good thing.
Yeah, exactly. And also it creates opportunities for those who would really thrive in the course, but just for no reason, fault of their own, just happen to have not been able to have done Latin beforehand.
Exactly.
I think also, so one thing that I've noticed when I've been doing the recent podcast with students on specific subject courses, I've noticed in the history of art one and linguistics, students saying how either they themselves or their peers, or especially their peers, if they'd known, let's take linguistics as an example, if they'd known about linguistics beforehand, or certain degrees beforehand, and what the course content was like, that they would have applied to it. And I think, and you could describe that knowledge as a term called culture capital, which in short would be knowledge that you had gained from being in certain cultures.
Yep.
And I think the stats of the ratios between independent school and maintained school is also sometimes a reflection of the different culture capital individuals have depending on which backgrounds they've come from. You know, in the History of Art podcast we did, when we really broke it down to its parts, we saw that it was very similar to subjects that that students study across all of the schools. We saw that was very similar to English and history, probably surprisingly actually quite more similar to English, which I assume almost every maintained school teaches, and a lot of students can do English A level and then do History of Art. But how many people know that is a path that they could take, or how many people know that they could do like an English A level and then go on to do something like linguistics? That knowledge, I guess in brief, it is sometimes is just depend. You have that knowledge depending on just who you know, and it's also, to kind of come back to the podcast, is also the main reason why we wanted to create this podcast and this platform, to kind of spread this culture capital as widely as possible, because everyone, like not everyone, but almost everyone has access to YouTube, and then now will watch a podcast like the History of Art one, realise that they have their A levels, that enables them to do that course, and might realise that this is something that they could do, and they might have not realised that if they hadn't seen that podcast.
Absolutely, and it comes down to something we were talking about a bit earlier, where it's for students to kind of take the initiative. I mean, sure, if your school draws your attention to something and says, oh, you might want to consider applying for History of Art or music or whatever, fine, that's great. But if you're at a school where, with the best will in the world, they just don't have the resources to do that, or, everyone's just a bit kind of overstretched and there's just, a lot of students to look after, you can find that stuff out yourself, and it's never been easier to find out that stuff yourself. And again, students who take the initiative at that stage and develop an interest in a subject that isn't exactly the same as something they're studying at school, but which, as you say, is closely connected to it, if you just pause to think about it, they're the ones who often apply with really convincing applications, because they've started to do that sort of independent study and thinking that we're looking for, and they'll just need to continue doing that at university, but they've already started it at the school level.
Nice, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, I don't know, I love organic chemistry, but I think linguistics has always been a course where I would look at and think, oh, I wish I'd.
It's never too late.
It's never too late, no. But it's just
lifelong learning.
It's just a lot harder. It's just, especially when we're having to do podcasts like this.
That's true. That's true.
Oh yeah, but yeah, I'd say organic chemistry is kind of a language in its own. So. It's. I know this podcast is about school type, but it is worth putting a lot of attention to your course choice, because I think students don't realise how many courses there are, and to kind of look into all of their courses. Yeah. So the next thing that we have on the list is. The high level number is 73% of 70 to 75% of the students come from maintained schools as of 2023, and I think like 20 or 25% come from independent schools. But that's not. I think that's not to say that all of that 75%, 73% aren't all from comprehensive schools, right?
No.
And I was wondering if you could break down what makes up that 75%.
It's the sort of subtypes of maintained sector schools that we mentioned earlier, really. So the comprehensive subtype is usually the largest, I guess. But then we get successful applicants from sixth form colleges, and we get successful applicants from grammar schools.
Yep.
And so it's really when you put together those various numbers that will give us the kind of high level number of the maintained sector. Again, it's on the publicly available statistics, things on the website. It's worth looking at some of the footnotes that explain how the numbers have been created, because sometimes people are at academies. So that's another sort of maintained sector type. And sometimes, there is a separate line that indicates the numbers for, people who applied from academies. And sometimes it's not there, but usually when it's not there, there's a little footnote that says it's been divided up between the other subtypes. So basically, if it's an academy and it's not selective, then it's been those numbers have been counted as comprehensive. And if it's an academy and it's selective, then those numbers have been counted for grammar school. And so it can sometimes make, for instance, the grammar school numbers look a little bit inflated, because it's all the things that are grammar schools and then selective academies as well. So those are the various subtypes, and they're sometimes counted slightly differently, but that's what added together makes up the high level maintained sector number.
That's a really good point. And that in today's world, grammar schools it's more appropriate to use the term selective schools, because there are institutions that might be new, built, I guess, quite recently. So were never grammar schools because they happen to be built recently, but they are selective, so you then act as in a similar fashion as grammar schools.
Exactly.
And the reason I wanted to bring this up is that there's a kind of opinion when there's a kind of opinion where someone will look at how the stats have changed from the 1990s and 2000s between maintained schools and independent schools, and see that there's a increase of proportion of maintained schools in Cambridge and Oxford. And we've already explained how that's due to rise of applications. But then there's also, I think there's a misleading message that, if 75% of the student body are from maintained schools, that means that a huge amount of students from comprehensive schools are going to Cambridge, which is true, but it's not 75. It's not the whole 75%.
No, absolutely.
And I think once all of this data is on the website of the Cambridge admissions data, and wants to go through the success rates of an application depending on your school type briefly. And I think if on average, if you come from a maintained school, you're as likely to be successful if you come from an independent school. They're both 20%. Within the maintained sector, sixth form colleges also roughly 20%. These stats are from 2023. And if you come from a grammar school, you're above average likelihood of getting into Cambridge. And the sixth form college, so the average was 20%. If you're coming from a comprehensive school, it's 16.5%. So it's below average, and which shows that there is still there is if someone says, oh well, there's no need for outreach because it's 75% to 25%, that's just not true when you look a bit further into the detail. And I hate for people to think that outreach has kind of succeeded and that we live in a kind of equal opportunity,
absolutely.
Because it shows that under the success rates. And the only way for that to change is for more students to apply from all schools, and given that most of the schools in the UK are comprehensive schools, if applications increased unanimously, there would be more applications from comprehensive schools for students to kind of get the information about Cambridge and the admissions process earlier. I was lucky that I went to a school trip at year 10. and looked around the city and really liked it and just had that seed. And it could easily be like whether it's a student vlogger on YouTube or this podcast or like a school trip, just something like that when you're 14, 15 to have the idea.
Yep.
And hopefully we come to a place where no matter what school type you go to, you come from, it's not about that. It's more about your curiosity and your potential for the course.
Yep.
I guess that leads on to the question: in like an ideal world, would there be a correlation between success rate and what school type an applicant has come from?
I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't really be talking about school type in a way, right? So for everyone, it depends what kind of ideal world you want. If in an ideal world you want sort of equal opportunities so that everyone has the same sort of opportunity regardless, then it would be, school type would be irrelevant. I think the reason, we're having this kind of conversation is because, it's not an ideal world. There are different types of schools, and the way that we've discussed in this podcast. And I think it's the job of those of us involved closely with the admissions process just to make sure that we're aware of those complexities and that we handle them appropriately. I think that's all we can do. And if there comes a point in the distant future when everything is so equal that we can stop talking about it, great. But I'll probably be retired, and you'll probably be retired by the time
there'd be no need for this podcast. We are talking about this more as a response to the myths that members of the public have, rather than an explanation of how we assess applicants. Well, we do a podcast which we have done, but we said from the very beginning that we don't have a bias for towards school type, and then we've been explaining how is it true? How can it be true that we don't have a bias towards school type given certain data, and just explaining that through the data, and that's kind of what we've been doing throughout this podcast. This narrative is, I think some people find this hard to believe, but I definitely think it's true. I can imagine if a student goes to an independent school and they look at the admission statistics and they see that only 25% of the proportion of students are from independent schools, and then they see that that's dropped since the 2000s, and they're a student who really wants to go to Oxford or Cambridge. What advice would you have for that student who feels discouraged looking at the data?
I think my advice for any student who feels discouraged looking at the data, whether they're at a maintained sector school or at an independent school, is kind of the same. I think I'd say, focus on the subject that you're interested in studying at university. Give time to supercurricular work around that subject. Really be honest with yourself and convince yourself that, yes, you have a genuine commitment to that subject. And if you do all of those things, that will come across in your application. And those are the things that we'll be focusing upon in the assessment. I mean, as I've said, we look at school type to contextualize applications. But the people who receive the offers are the people who have the sort of curiosity and intensity towards their academic subject that we've mentioned a few times. So that would be my advice, apply as competitively as possible by emphasizing those sorts of things. And we will see that in your application. We'll hopefully see it in the admissions assessment that you take if you have to take one. We'll explore it in your interviews. And if you convince us that you're a really good fit for our course, you'll receive an offer.
Exactly. It's the students applying that makes the data.
Yes, that's right.
That's right. And if you were to, whatever you do, you have a contribution to the new data, which is which could also be applying.
Yeah.
And
if you don't like one of the existing patterns in the data, apply and help change the pattern.
Exactly. Yeah. And and that's a bit of tongue in cheek, but you're right as well that if you want to study to Cambridge, you should apply as well. It is that simple.
Yep.
And there's the entry. I mean, this is how I approached the process when I was applying. I looked at the courses. Was really enjoying chemistry. Loved organic chemistry. Looked at the entry requirements. Looked at recommended A-level choices. And thought, well, if I do well in these certain things, these parts of that application process, get at least these grades, and was given an offer, then it should all be fine. Never really thought too much about the myths, I don't know, the kind of question of is Cambridge for someone like myself? Just by chance was a question that I thought about afterwards, and I think there is something to gain about just sticking to what the admissions process and the grades, and not because it does go back to that. Out of curiosity, because I've never actually asked this. When you were applying, did you come from a school that had a lot of Oxbridge applicants?
No, it didn't. It didn't have a lot of Oxbridge applicants. So I went to, when I was there, it was a comprehensive school. Yeah. It had been a grammar school, so it was part of that pattern that we described earlier. It had been a grammar school, and it became a comprehensive school, I think, in the 70s. So when I was there, it was a comprehensive, no, it didn't routinely send students to Oxbridge at all, and there was very little support and information and advice. I mean, lots of well-intentioned people, but not a great deal of really useful guidance. So it was let's say very low probability that I might end up applying and let alone be successful.
Yeah. So was applying for linguistics in Cambridge something you always wanted to do, or?
I mean, I was basically feral. No, it was never a kind of lifelong plan at all. It was something that happened very, very last minute by chance, and then sort of ended up, working out well. But it certainly wasn't, something that I decided to do when I was, 8 or something, and then work gradually towards it.
Was it like a teacher's recommendation, or?
Kind of. The headmaster at the school thought that I was bright and I had some ability. I thought he was joking.
And that's why he thought you were bright. And that's
I guess. Well, no, it works. So I applied very reluctantly and very sort of skeptically. But maybe that ended up being a beneficial thing. I don't know.
Nice. I mean, students are they're very different. They have all different types of personalities, but maybe not reluctancy, but skepticism is a good characteristic to have for an undergraduate course. I mean, it's unlikely for a young person to realise that their skepticism is exactly the reason why that they're made for Cambridge. But how come? So then, were you always interested in linguistics?
No, I wasn't really interested in academic stuff. I mean, I wasn't a particularly good student at school because I didn't take it particularly seriously. When I was at school, I was interested in other things, and I guess that's a sort of long story for a future podcast. But basically, it came down to me having to have a spinal fusion when I was 16, and that sort of changed my sort of focus. So I wouldn't recommend that as part of of the admissions process. It's quite an atypical component in a sort of an admissions process. But that was the thing that had the biggest impact on what I ended up doing.
And then that led you to do more academic stuff.
Yeah, because I couldn't do anything else. Simple simple as that. Sometimes good to have very few options, because then you have to really focus.
I mean, it's a brilliant example of showing how when we say like, out of no fault of the student, did they end up doing what they did? Sounds like you were stitched up to do this.
Pretty much, yeah. But I've got over that.
Oh, nice. That's brilliant. I think, I don't think there's anything we missed out. Anyone who's watching and they still have questions, we generally did. For preparing this podcast, all of the data, all of everything that we've said is from the admission stats, which is in the caption. And Oxford also do admission stats, and I assume, I believe the universities as well have admission stats as well, so you can look at the data, and they're long reports. So like there's a lot of information there, and if you are interested in listening to us talk about hypothetical situations, like hypothetical students where or past examples of students that situations where we're assessing applicants, we did an hour-long podcast on how we assess applications, and we talk about different school types, different situations. So I'd really recommend listening to that, watching that podcast. That will also be in the caption. So stay tuned. We're going to be doing more podcasts on different courses and that the university offers, hopefully getting more students in. Stay tuned.